Sanbonani, Dumelang, Dimatsiare, Litikane. Good afternoon. Can I push this aside? I'll put it down here. Kevin phoned me and asked me to talk to financial journalists. Now, the first question I had to answer was, what would be underlying the request? Because I'm not a journalist, I'm not a financial analyst, I'm a mine worker. What I know best is to break the rock. I did that for 14 years, and I organized mine workers for the remaining 17, 18 years. So I'm basically a mine worker. So talking to financial journalists is a big and a tall order for me. But I then concluded this, among other things, what I would try to do is to facilitate an engagement around the current topics that are in the public domain, so that I can also have an opportunity to learn from you. Therefore, it's not just a question of me telling you and then leave. I think the value will be more on the discussion and questions. When you actually ask the difficult questions to me, in the process of trying to answer those difficult questions, I will be learning as well. So you will be teaching me as well one thing or two. Let us begin by what I see as the role of the state in the economy. One, the ANC believes strongly in a mixed economy. Now, when we talk of the mixed economy, we mean that both the private and the public sector should be strong. And that should be the starting point, and resultantly, the responsibility of the state, therefore, is to develop policies that address that reality. So any policy that comes out of the ANC and the state would be informed by the objective of building a mixed economy, a strong public sector and a strong private sector. That's why for many years the ANC described itself in a way that meant nothing, actually, if you come to think of it, as neither socialist nor capitalist. That's how it described itself. And therefore, that was correct at the time because it had to appeal to the wide range of donors and supporters as a liberation movement. We have not moved much away from that point, except that we have now affiliated to the Socialist International, which is an organization internationally of social democrats. And therefore, without defining ourselves as social democrats, our policies will be more inclined to be social democratic in outlook and nature. And therefore, that result, and equally important, therefore, will be the role of the state of ensuring distribution of wealth and income among citizens. Now, over the past 15 years, the ANC focused on a strong macroeconomic policy, which many describe as very narrow, and many see that policy as very conservative. I don't know how you feel about that. Strong focusing on the macroeconomic policy, and they credit it for the strong financial system and financial institutions. That's why our institutions stood the recession and the financial and economic meltdown over the last few years. And I think that is ascribed to that policy, which is very conservative. But they also attribute to it the many years of jobless economic growth. Now, during which period, over a decade, we experienced economic growth where unemployment for half of that time stagnated or declined. There was shrinking of employment and decline thereof. But the misgiving from the working class formations in the main, COSATU very vocal about it, is that the first decade of the freedom was more beneficial to capital, and workers had very little to show for it, despite the role that they played in the struggle for freedom. And the decision, therefore, of the 52nd National Conference of the ANC in Polokwane in 2007 of focusing and placing industrial policy at the center of the economic policy is informed by the desire to intervene in the real economy. And the development, therefore, of both the industrial policy action plan and the new growth path is an attempt to implement that resolution, where we're focusing on sectors of the economy. If you look into the new growth path, I would imagine that you have all read it 10 times or 15 times. When it talks about the job drivers, those job drivers are nothing more than sectors of the economy that are seen as having the potential to create employment and actually trigger and accelerate growth of the economy. And therefore, when in 2011, in the budget, we made provision for resources for employment creation, whether it is the 10 billion employment fund of the state or the 10 billion of the IDC or the 23 billion tax concession, all that is intended to incentivize the private sector to be more aggressive in creating employment and creating and expanding productive capacity of the economy. Therefore, the intention of that money is that it's not going to be Father Christmas dishing out money, because you have this total of about 43 billion rand that is put there for employment creation, that it will be dished out as Father Christmas. That money can only be given to companies that expand productive economy and actually quantify the number of new jobs created. Therefore, that is one way of implementing a resolution of the ANC conference. Now, I'm making this point because the ANC believes that the actual strategic center of power is the ANC. And the ANC in government is actually supposed to implement the ANC policy. And there's nothing wrong about that, because we have a party political system. Therefore, any politician that contests election and wins, that party will implement its program. And therefore, I'm referring to the ANC policies because it is the ANC policies that inform the government policy and program. That's why this weekend, from Thursday up to Sunday, we'll be having an ANC NEC Lekgotla in preparation for the cabinet in Lekgotla next year. That is preparing for the midterm budget of the government, and will continue doing so and go in January and go in July all the time, so that what we take as decisions of the ANC impact on the program of the government and the state in a way. So many financial journalists have been critical, therefore, for example, of the ANC Youth League raising the question of nationalization of the mines and other key sectors. And my premise is that the fundamental questions being raised there are missed. And the debate, I tell the ANC Youth League, I tell everybody that actually the debate is superficial, and it is focusing on the non-issues rather than focusing on the underlying questions that are being raised. Among these questions is that if the private sector continues to reap profits without ensuring that communities around those mines benefit, obviously you are planting the seeds for a revolt. That's why when the Youth League goes high, the cacophony of noise that we must nationalize the mine, we'll distribute the money, you create an impression in the mind of people that once it is nationalized, then you mine the mineral, you sell it, you dish the money out. And it doesn't work that way. All it means is that it is change of ownership from the private sector to the state, and therefore the state can use that money in its normal role of redistribution of wealth and income. But that debate of the poverty, the growing unemployment, the deepening poverty, the growing inequality in society get missed in the debate of just focusing on the ideological debate of nationalization or non-nationalization. And my own view is that what we should be interrogating as financial journalists is to talk to the actual underlying issues. Why do we see abject poverty around wealth? And what is the impact of that if you have a belt of platinum mines in Limpopo, stretching from Rustenburg in the northwest through Limpopo right into Mpumalanga, and all those communities have one thing in common, and that is abject poverty. And therefore, what is it that we need to do? And therefore, in other words, my own view is that it is the brutality of business and the drive for profit maximization at all costs that is at the center of the debate. It is not the word nationalization. And I think we should interrogate that. And the approach of the ANC to review case studies is the most scientific one. We'll be looking into 13 case studies and say, how did these countries use the state ownership or any other state intervention when they were having rich primary commodities in their economies, and use that to actually benefit society. And the 13 case studies, if you want to know, will be of Botswana. And the question we'll ask about Botswana is that how does DBS agree on a 51-41 arrangement in Botswana and almost protest here even if you raise 10%? But they agree in Botswana to have a 51-49 arrangement in terms of shareholding and even better dividends paid to the state. In Namibia, they agree on a 60-40, but they protest here. We'll look into Botswana, we'll look into Namibia. We'll look into Zambia for historic reasons. Because Zambia did nationalize its mines, it was a disaster. It went to full-scale privatization. Now they want to look into how do they mix that ownership. They're looking into all permutations in the ownership of their mineral wealth. That is what we're going to look in Africa. We'll go to Latin America. Actually, I can say that we've done Zambia already. We've done the 3 case studies in Latin America, which is Brazil, which is Chile, and which is Venezuela. We've done that. We'll go to the Nordic countries. We've done half the work there, where we look into Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and ask a question, how did, for example, Finland had Nokia, which was a mining and a forestry company, that was turned into a high-tech company. What journey did they travel to convert Nokia from a primary commodity company into a high-tech company? So we left those 3 case studies. We'll go to Asia, we'll look into China, we'll look into Malaysia. We'll also look into Australian approach to actual taxation, because Australia didn't opt for ownership, they opt for taxation. So by the time we go to our policy conference mid-year in 2012, we'll be able to say, here are the 13 case studies, and this is what we want to do. And these are the recommendations based on what other countries are doing in that regard. And our view is that that approach is quite a scientific approach that you can use and to avoid reinventing the wheel and committing mistakes that were committed by others. And therefore, how did they use that money to boost the fiscus, and how do they use it to actually benefit the people? For example, there are linkages from between the ownership of the mineral deposit in Botswana and the level of education there, and the aggressive education program and the quality thereof. In 2009, we have identified 5 priority areas that would focus on over the 5 years ending in 2014. If you look at them, they may not be talking to the first issue of economic growth and employment creation, but in a big way, they do talk to it. For example, we identify education as that issue. If you see the division of that department into two ministries, it was intended to have two ministers having a focus on education. And look into the quality of education. When we saw the first annual national assessment of basic education for grade 3, 6, and 9, that is a more transparent way to say to society, our education is not up to scratch, so that we can get ideas on how to improve it. Because unless we actually get education right, the skills level and the relationship between the education system and the skills generation, unless we get that combination correct, we are not going to achieve what we want to achieve in the long term. And we identify health as such. Again, if you go to health, any healthy nation is a productive nation. A sick nation is not a productive nation. If we are having 0.7 of the population of the world and 17% of the HIV and AIDS in the world, we are actually facing a disaster. And therefore, we have to look into health as one such issue. And I think we have a very energetic person running that department in Dr. Mtswaledi, who is quite enthusiastic and quite energetic. And I think he's doing the right things, both in the area of HIV and AIDS, in terms of the system itself, in terms of the skills profile of the department. I can tell you now, within the next few weeks, you will see a government gazette on actual re-advertising CEOs of hospitals. Because one of the things that we've discovered when we did our own research, we discovered that there are quite a number of hospitals that are run by non-health workers. In our view, this theory of you don't need to be a doctor to run a hospital has been taken to the extreme. It was taken from the British system, but what was left out is that in the British system, if you are not a doctor and you are running a health institution, you must at least have an MBA in health. And that was left out. And therefore, this thing of appointing teachers, meat inspectors, and postmasters to run hospitals cannot work. So we're looking into those issues, and all of them are intended to have an economy that is working. And the results are going to show before long. I think the National Health Insurance Scheme, Dr. Mtswaledi has a clear approach to the National Health Insurance Scheme. He says, yes, we need it, or everybody agrees. But he says you cannot just introduce it in a dysfunctional system. Make the system functional, and if you must phase it in, linked to the functionality of the various institutions, that's what we should do, so that we don't commit mistake of throwing money at the problem instead of looking into the improvement of the quality of health. Equally important is the fight against corruption and crime. Now, these, again, are quite important to me because at this point in time, we don't seem to be very coherent in fighting both crime and corruption. Though there are marginal improvements that we have seen if you look into the crime statistics, but more important to me, it is the first step of actually being vocal about it, open, talking about it is quite a first step, but it is not good enough. You can never actually defeat either crime or corruption by just making noise. The only way that can lead to, that is a real deterrent to crime and corruption, is arrest, prosecution, and conviction. And if we are not successful in that chain of arrest, prosecution, and conviction, we are not going to have a real deterrent to crime and corruption. At this point in time, there's a lot of generalization about crime, that everything is crime. If ministers buy expensive cars, it is almost put in the category of crime. If they live in one and the only, which is a very expensive hotel, it is almost put in the category of crime instead of dealing with it as a moral issue when there is recession. And because we don't make this distinction, it actually impact on the image of the country. And the important thing about the image of the country, which half the time we ignore, is that if the image of the country is not an issue for all of us, we get punished in a number of ways. Investors categorize us in a particular way. Credit agencies do give us a lower credit rating, and the impact of that economically is unbelievable, and sometimes we don't link the two. And therefore, my own view is that we need to become more and more circumspect in making generalized statements in dealing with serious problems. Because one of the issues that lead to that is what I see as a trend in newsrooms. I don't know, I've never been to any newsroom. You can say it's not true. But that's our observation, is that for any journalist to be seen to be a good journalist, he must be seen to be attacking the ANC left, right, and center. Yeah. If you are attacking the ANC, you become a good journalist and you become deployed into serious assignments and so forth. Otherwise, if you don't, and that's why you find out that, for example, you sit for a period of people predicting an ANC that will decline in the local government elections. When those results do not tally with the prediction, 63.65% of the votes and more than 71% of the municipalities to control become a failure. No, the ANC has lost. But we're controlling more than 71%, 198 outright, and out close to 20 in coalitions. And that cannot be a decline. We're controlling more than 80% of municipalities, either directly or in coalitions. And for any political party, I'm the Secretary General of the ANC, basically running it on day to day. I'm not in Parliament. I'm just working for the ANC. To me, that is what I measure every day. But how can this thing be seen as a failure when we're actually still asserting ourselves? And as politicians, we do one thing, analysis of the global trends, and say, if you go to Europe, many of the parties, social democratic parties in Europe, have actually collapsed after the recession. It is the right-wing party and the conservative party that have taken over power in the majority of European countries. It is not the case here. And when people imagine it, they must actually be scientific in writing about it. That's my argument. Rather than imagine a trend in Europe and describe it as reality in South Africa, because it is not. Now, and therefore, even when you talk about, Anton, the threat to media freedoms, threat to media freedom. People talk about the Protection of Information Bill, and they say it is a media bill. You have to argue it until you are blue in your face to say it's not a media bill. It is a security bill, and it must be discussed as such. And if the issues that are raised are about how does it interfere with the media freedom, that must be raised. But to just conflate it, because I normally look at the advert of ETV, where they conflate the Protection of Information Bill and the discussion on the possibility of a media appeals tribunal, as if it's one discussion. And I know that it's a function of attitude, rather than the reality of what is on the table. Now, and therefore, in a society like ours, where there are open discussion, in this country, you can discuss anything. Nobody knocks at your door. You can attack the president. You can say anything. We read articles every time. Zuma that, Zuma this, and Zuma that. And you don't put police on the people because of that. And many people over there, when I was in Botswana, one of the most cherished democracies, and I listened to a discussion in a conference on how best to tighten the control over the trade unions, make teaching an essential service, make diamond mining an essential service, make veterinary service an essential service. I said, I can tell you that if you can try that in South Africa, you will die in the pool the same day. We can't even think of it. It's not an essential service. Health, yes, this, that. But mining, how can it be an essential service? Basically, to limit the capital of those workers to go on strike. And I say, only when the fountain becomes dried in drought do you realize its full value. When there's still a fountain and there's water, you don't appreciate the full value of it until it is dry and there is drought. Now, let me come close to the conclusion, because the value is in the discussion with you. I'm arguing that for this country to remain stable, we need a strong, a united, and a stable ANC. Do I sound arrogant? That's what we need in the country, because sometimes when people argue, it's an argument in many of our colleagues from social democratic countries that liberation movement in Southern Africa are just too strong. They must have a majority, but it must be 52, 53, 54. This is too big, and they're too strong, and therefore that will create problems. I think what will create problems is a weak government. A weak government creates problems. I can tell you, we have an experience of running municipalities and provinces in coalitions. It's the most difficult thing to do, because before you take any decision, you have to convince your partners in the coalition, and you can't take any decision on anything until your partners agree. We have a limited experience of that, and I say once it is fully fledged and fully blown as a form of government, only at that point will South Africans appreciate that. What is it that is a problem in governing in Italy? Now, and therefore, on the recent past, the period between 2005, I'm sure the question of a measure of paralysis and turmoil can actually translate into very weak governance and impossibility of implementing anything. The challenge for us, therefore, is to foster institutional stability as an integral part of bolstering our country's development, growth, and ultimately giving impetus to our democracy, which is still burgeoning at this stage. Let me conclude with the words from Cesare Tsegama, because I believe they are relevant today as they were when they were said. Let me read them. I think that the trouble we now face in the world is caused mainly by the refusal to try and see another man's point of view, to try and persuade by example, and the refusal to meet a rather passionate desire to impose your own will upon others, either by force or other means. I think when he said that in Blantyre in 1967, those words were correct then, they are correct now. And that's why many of our debates in South Africa get polarized, is this question of intolerance of another person's view. Thank you very much.